It was a chilly winter evening when I boarded the last train from Delhi to Shimla. The platform was eerily silent, and a thick fog had settled over the tracks, creating an ominous atmosphere. As I found my seat in the nearly empty compartment, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The train started moving, its wheels clattering rhythmically against the tracks. I glanced around and noticed an elderly couple sitting a few seats away, their faces pale and tense. A young woman sat across from me, her eyes darting nervously as if she too sensed the strange air of unease. An hour into the journey, the lights in the compartment flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The train suddenly slowed down and came to a halt in the middle of nowhere. Outside, the fog had thickened, and I could barely see beyond the window. The conductor, a gaunt man with hollow eyes, appeared at the door. His voice was a whisper as he announced that there was a technical issue and the train would be delayed. He assured us that everything would be fine, but his words did little to calm my growing anxiety. As the minutes turned into hours, the tension in the compartment became palpable. The elderly couple whispered to each other in hushed tones, while the young woman fidgeted nervously. I decided to stretch my legs and walk down the aisle, hoping to find some answers. Passing through the carriages, I noticed that they were all empty, save for a few passengers who appeared equally disturbed. When I reached the end of the train, I found a locked door leading to a carriage that seemed abandoned. A sense of dread washed over me, but curiosity got the better of me, and I peered through the small window. Inside, the carriage was dimly lit, and I could make out shadowy figures sitting motionless. My heart pounded as I realized they were not passengers, but spectral apparitions, their faces twisted in anguish. I stumbled back in horror, and as I did, the door suddenly creaked open, revealing the dark interior. A cold wind swept through the train, and the temperature dropped sharply. The spectral figures began to move, their hollow eyes fixed on me. Panic set in, and I turned to run back to my seat. But the train's corridors seemed endless, and the lights flickered erratically. As I reached my compartment, I saw that the elderly couple and the young woman were gone. The seats were empty, and the air was thick with an oppressive silence. I sank into my seat, my mind racing with fear and confusion. Just then, the train jolted forward and began to move again, its wheels screeching against the tracks. I looked out the window and saw that the fog had lifted slightly, revealing an old, dilapidated station. The nameplate read Phantom Station, and it looked as though it had been abandoned for decades. The train came to a stop, and the conductor reappeared, his face now a skeletal mask of death. "End of the line," he said in a chilling voice. "Everyone off." I was paralyzed with fear, but I knew I had to leave the train. As I stepped onto the platform, I noticed the other passengers had disembarked as well, their faces blank and lifeless. We were surrounded by the spectral figures from the abandoned carriage, their mournful wails echoing through the night. The station was a realm of the dead, and I realized with a sinking heart that we were trapped in a ghostly limbo. The train had been a conduit between the living and the dead, and now we were part of its haunted journey. The spectral conductor motioned for us to follow him, and we were led into the depths of the Phantom Station, where our souls would be bound forever. As we descended into the darkness, I knew that no one would ever know our fate, and the Phantom Express would continue its eerie journey, collecting lost souls along the way. It was a dark, stormy night when I boarded the train bound for Kolkata. The wind howled outside, and the rain lashed against the windows, creating an unsettling ambiance. My seat was in carriage number 9, a compartment that had an air of abandonment and decay. As the train lurched forward, I settled into my seat, hoping to get some sleep before we reached our destination. The carriage was nearly empty, save for a few other passengers, who looked just as uneasy as I felt. An old man with a cane, a middle-aged woman clutching a rosary, and a young boy with a haunted expression sat scattered throughout the compartment. The train's rhythmic chugging was interrupted by occasional jolts and creaks, adding to the eerie atmosphere. I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was being watched. The dim lights flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. An hour into the journey, I heard a faint whispering sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the whispers grew louder and more distinct. They seemed to be coming from the far end of the carriage. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. As I walked down the aisle, I noticed the other passengers were now motionless, their eyes closed as if in a trance. The whispers grew louder, and I could make out words spoken in an old dialect I couldn't understand. When I reached the end of the carriage, I saw a door slightly ajar, leading to a small compartment that appeared to be unused. I pushed the door open and was met with a chilling sight. The compartment was filled with old, dusty luggage and cobwebs. In the center of the room stood a figure, shrouded in darkness. It was a woman, her face obscured by a veil. She turned slowly to face me, and I was paralyzed by the sight of her hollow, lifeless eyes. The whispers turned into a mournful wail, and the temperature in the room plummeted. I tried to move, but my legs felt like lead. The woman began to speak in a raspy voice, recounting a tragic tale of betrayal and murder that had occurred on this very train many years ago. According to her story, she had been a passenger on carriage number 9, traveling with her husband and young daughter. They had been attacked by a gang of robbers who had killed her husband and taken her daughter. She had been left to die in this very compartment, and her spirit had been trapped here ever since. As she spoke, the room seemed to close in around me, and I could feel her pain and anguish. The shadows in the room grew darker, and I could hear the faint cries of her lost daughter echoing through the compartment. I realized with a sinking heart that I was now part of her haunting. Suddenly, the train jolted violently and the lights went out. I was plunged into darkness, with only the sound of the woman's wails and the cries of her daughter filling the air. I stumbled back into the aisle, trying to escape the chilling presence that surrounded me. When I reached my seat, the lights flickered back on, and the other passengers seemed to wake from their trance. The old man with the cane looked at me with a knowing expression and whispered, "You've seen her, haven't you? The ghost of carriage number 9. I nodded, too shaken to speak. The rest of the journey was a blur, with the whispers and wails echoing in my mind. When we finally arrived in Kolkata, I was relieved to leave the train, but the haunting memories stayed with me. To this day, I avoid trains, especially those with a carriage number 9. The ghostly encounter left a mark on my soul, and I know that the spirit of the woman and her lost daughter still haunt that cursed carriage, seeking justice and peace. It was the dead of night when I boarded the train from Mumbai to Goa. The platform was deserted, and an eerie stillness hung in the air. My ticket was for a sleeper compartment, and I found my berth in a dimly lit carriage. The other berths were empty, and the silence was oppressive. The train began its journey with a lurch, the rhythmic chugging of the wheels against the tracks providing a steady, if unsettling, background noise. I settled into my berth, the dim light casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to dance with the motion of the train. I tried to shake off the growing sense of unease, convincing myself it was just the fatigue from a long day. Despite my efforts to rest, sleep eluded me. The monotonous clatter of the train, which usually lulled me into slumber, only served to heighten my sense of alertness. The oppressive silence of the empty carriage was occasionally broken by the creaking of the train and the distant rumble of thunder from the storm outside. I stared at the ceiling, the shadows shifting in the corners of my vision, and a gnawing feeling of being watched crept over me. Suddenly, I heard a soft, ghostly whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the whispers grew louder and more distinct. They seemed to be coming from the far end of the carriage. My heart pounded in my chest as curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. I stepped into the corridor and the temperature dropped sharply, a chill that seemed to seep into my very bones. A thick fog had enveloped the carriage, and I could barely see a few feet ahead. The whispers continued, an unintelligible murmur that sent shivers down my spine. I followed the sound, each step filled with mounting dread. At the end of the corridor, I saw a figure standing in the fog. It was a woman dressed in a tattered white gown, her long hair cascading over her face. She turned slowly to face me, and I gasped in horror. Her eyes were hollow, and her face was a mask of despair. She began to speak, her voice a haunting melody that seemed to echo through the carriage. "I was once a passenger on this train, many years ago," she began. "I was traveling to meet my lover, but he betrayed me. He lured me here with promises of love and a future together. But instead, He murdered me in cold blood. My spirit has been trapped on this train ever since, reliving my final moments in a never-ending cycle of pain and sorrow. As she spoke, the fog thickened, and the temperature continued to drop. The woman's story seemed to come to life around me, and I could hear the faint sounds of a struggle, the echoes of her final moments. The oppressive cold became almost unbearable, and I could see my breath in the air. Suddenly, the train jolted violently, and the lights flickered before going out entirely. I was plunged into darkness, with only the sound of the woman's wails and the distant cries of her struggle filling the air. Panic set in, and I stumbled back, trying to find my way to the safety of my berth. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, and the oppressive darkness pressed in from all sides. As I hurried back, the woman's figure appeared intermittently in the flickering light, her eyes filled with an unending sorrow. Her presence was overwhelming, and I felt an icy hand grip my shoulder, freezing me in place. Her voice echoed in my ears. "Help me find peace. Help me find justice." In my terror, I managed to break free and I staggered back to my berth. The lights flickered back on, and the fog dissipated as suddenly as it had appeared. The oppressive silence remained, but the ghostly whispers had ceased. I sat in my berth, trembling and drenched in cold sweat, trying to make sense of what I had just experienced. The rest of the journey was a blur, with my mind racing and my heart pounding. The oppressive feeling of being watched lingered, and I could not shake off the haunting presence of the woman. When we finally arrived in Goa, I stumbled off the train, grateful to be on solid ground and away from the haunted carriage. But the memories stayed with me, vivid and terrifying. I avoided trains for months, unable to rid myself of the image of the hollow-eyed woman and her tragic story. I began to research the train route and discovered an old, unsolved murder case that matched the woman's tale. It was said that a young woman, betrayed and murdered by her lover, had indeed traveled on that very train route decades ago. Her body had never been found, and her spirit was said to haunt the train, seeking justice and peace. Determined to help her find rest, I gathered the evidence and contacted local authorities. The case was reopened, and with modern forensic techniques, the remains of the woman were finally discovered in a hidden compartment of the train. Her lover, long suspected but never convicted, was brought to justice posthumously, his crimes laid bare for all to see. The woman's spirit finally found peace, and the haunting presence on the train ceased. I felt a profound sense of relief and closure, knowing that I had helped bring justice to a soul trapped in sorrow. To this day, I still avoid traveling by train at night, the memories of that ghostly encounter forever etched in my mind. The Midnight Specter had left a mark on my soul, a chilling reminder of the lingering echoes of past injustices and the restless spirits that seek closure. It was a cold, rainy evening when I boarded the sleeper train from Bangalore to Chennai. The platform was nearly empty, and an eerie silence hung in the air. My ticket was for a secluded corner of the sleeper car, and I settled in, hoping for a quiet journey. The other berths around me were unoccupied, and the carriage had an air of abandonment. As the train began its journey, I noticed an old, musty smell in the air. The lights flickered occasionally, casting long shadows on the walls. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The rhythmic chugging of the wheels on the tracks was usually a comforting sound, but tonight, it only added to my unease. An hour into the journey, the train suddenly jolted, and the lights went out. I heard a faint, ghostly whisper, and my heart began to race. The whispers grew louder, and I could make out words spoken in an old dialect I couldn't understand. I stepped into the corridor, and the temperature dropped sharply. A thick fog had enveloped the carriage, and I could barely see a few feet ahead. The whispers continued, and I followed the sound, my fear growing with each step. At the end of the corridor, I saw a figure standing in the fog. It was a man dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his face twisted in anguish. He turned slowly to face me, and I gasped in horror. His eyes were hollow, and his face was a mask of despair. The man began to speak, his voice a haunting melody that sent shivers down my spine. "I was once a passenger on this train, many years ago," he began. "I was traveling to meet my family, but I was murdered by a fellow passenger. My spirit has been trapped on this train ever since, doomed to relive my final moments in a never-ending cycle of pain and sorrow. As he spoke, the fog thickened, and I could hear the faint sounds of a struggle. The temperature continued to drop, and I could see my breath in the cold air. The man's story seemed to come to life around me, and I felt a chill of terror. The spectral man moved closer, his eyes filled with an unending sorrow. "Help me find peace," he pleaded. "Help me find justice." His hand reached out, and I felt an icy grip on my arm. My skin tingled with cold, and I knew I had to do something to help him. The train jolted again, and the fog lifted slightly. The man disappeared, leaving me alone in the corridor. The whispers had ceased, but the oppressive silence remained. I hurried back to my berth, my mind racing with fear and confusion. The rest of the journey was a blur. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting the spectral man to reappear at any moment. When we finally arrived in Chennai, I stumbled off the train, grateful to be on solid ground and away from the haunted carriage. But the memories stayed with me, vivid and terrifying. I couldn't shake off the haunting presence of the man and his tragic story. Determined to help him find peace, I began to research the train route and discovered an old unsolved murder case that matched his tale. It was said that a man traveling to meet his family had been murdered on the train many years ago. His killer had never been found, and his spirit was said to haunt the train, seeking justice. I gathered all the information I could find and contacted the local authorities. The case was reopened, and with modern forensic techniques, new evidence was discovered. The remains of the man were finally found hidden in a secret compartment of the train, along with clues that led to the identity of his killer. The killer, a former passenger who had since passed away, was posthumously convicted, and the man's family was finally able to give him a proper burial. As the truth came to light, I felt a profound sense of relief and closure, knowing that I had helped bring justice to a soul trapped in sorrow. One night, while I was alone in my apartment, I felt a sudden chill. I turned to see the spectral man standing in the corner of the room. But this time, his eyes were no longer filled with despair. They were peaceful. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice no longer a haunting melody, but a gentle, grateful tone. "I can finally rest." With that, he faded away, and the room returned to its normal temperature. The haunting presence was gone, and I knew that the man had found the peace he had been seeking for so long. To this day, I still avoid traveling by train at night. The ghostly encounter left a mark on my soul, a chilling reminder of the lingering echoes of past injustices and the restless spirits that seek closure. The haunted sleeper car had taught me that some journeys are not just about reaching a destination, but also about uncovering the truths that lie hidden in the shadows.